The Prison of Poverty. City of God follows the lives of multiple characters living through the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, which we see through the perspective and narration of Rocket, an aspiring photographer. However, due to the multiple characters and storylines, Rocket is arguably not the main character. Instead, the environment in which City of God is situated becomes the definitive main character of the narrative. When talking about poverty in Brazil, it is important to look at the history of colonialism and slavery in Brazil, as it has impacted the long-lasting systemic effects on the socio-economic status of the class divide in Brazil. Favelas are an important and distinct example of the system's failings for its people. A favela is a shantytown located within or on the outskirts of a country's large cities, most notably in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Favelas are created when displaced people occupy the vacant land at the edge of a city and forge shanties from salvaged or stolen materials. As the system does not value the life of the residents in these favelas, neither do they. The environment is as cheap as life is. As the cycle of crime continues, it grows more violent. The viewers have our first glimpse of crime through the trials of the Tender Trio, who, after realizing the graphic and gruesome effects of crimes and the deadly aftermath, plan their escape to a better life outside of the favelas, which unfortunately ends their fate. The audience is locked in the favelas in which the characters survive in, subjugating and entrenching the viewer into the world. Additionally, Brazil had the highest volume of slaves imported from Africa and was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. To this day, South America has the highest population of black people or people of African descent outside of Africa. When slavery was finally abolished in Brazil, freed slaves had nothing to start their newly free lives. From this, we can assume that most of the criminals, especially the black characters, are descendants of slaves. Due to colorism, which is discrimination or prejudice between those usually of the same race towards individuals of a darker skin complexion, we see darker skinned characters are more predominant within the gangs than lighter characters, and the only characters who are not from the favelas are lighter skinned. This is also shown by Lil Dice, arguably the film's antagonist, who is one of the darkest characters within the film. From this, we can see the generational impact of slavery that result in the characters suffering through claustrophobic environment of the favelas. Despite taking place in Rio de Janeiro, the audience never see the iconic and defining statue of Christ the Redeemer, which is absent throughout the film, highlighting the significant distance that the characters have from escaping poverty. The entirety of the film takes place in the same environment from start to finish, rarely leaving their environment to show the varying aspects of Rio de Janeiro, further emphasizing the entrapment the characters are in. This disconnect from the statue symbolizes the absence of God. As we see Lil Dice sell his soul, it becomes apparent that God is not present or has turned its back on the city of God. Meirelles and Lund use 16mm film, which gives the film a documentary type aesthetic throughout the film. However, Meirelles' advertising background shines through to give experimental and quirky shots and angles, which further highlights the adolescence and rush of the film. The fast-paced, energetic open prepares the viewer for the film's pace. These close-up techniques are used regularly to intensify the claustrophobic environment, whilst also encouraging and forcing the viewer to partake. We see multiple characters attempt to leave the city of God for a new and better life, such as Benny, who was murdered while celebrating his departure in the crime world, Shaggy, who is shot and killed by the police whilst attempting to flee the favelas, and Goose, who is shot whilst trying to escape the police. But due to extreme poverty they are imprisoned in a cycle of crime, which inevitably leads to an early death. From that economic environment, a cycle of crime is born. From the lack of job prospects, lack of funding, and early education mixed with the need to sustain themselves, they turn to crime as a way to survive. The film ends with a gruesome ending image of Lil Dice's deceased body, as the viewer is left to assume the extremely young and illiterate Rut will follow in the same footsteps of those before them, with no end in sight in the cycle of crime propagated by the continued cycle of poverty.